My name is Stephen Harper, and for most of my life I believed I understood poverty. I had read articles, watched documentaries, donated to charities, and occasionally bought meals for people sitting on sidewalks with cardboard signs. Every time I walked away, I felt sympathy, but I also carried the quiet confidence that I understood their situation. I was wrong. One evening, after finishing another article about homelessness in America, I realized that all my opinions were built on distance. I had never gone a single day without a locked front door, a warm shower, or a guaranteed meal. That realization refused to leave my mind. After several weeks of planning, I made a decision that shocked my friends and terrified my family. I would spend 10 consecutive days living exactly as a homeless person. I would carry only the clothes on my back, a worn backpack containing a blanket, one bottle of water, a notebook, a pen, and $20 that I promised myself I would only use if my life was truly in danger. My apartment keys, wallet, credit cards, smartwatch, and every symbol of my normal life would remain locked inside my apartment. I wanted no shortcuts. I wanted to discover what happened when comfort disappeared. On a cool Monday morning, I walked out of my apartment building, locked the door behind me, handed the spare key to my brother, and told him not to contact me unless there was an emergency. The moment he drove away, I felt something strange. Although I was standing in the same city where I had lived for 8 years, it suddenly looked unfamiliar. The coffee shops smelled richer than ever because I knew I could not afford to enter them. Office workers hurried along the sidewalks holding expensive cups of coffee while staring at their phones. Nobody looked at me. At first, that felt liberating. I was invisible. Within an hour, it became painfully lonely. Around lunchtime my stomach reminded me that I had skipped breakfast. Normally I would have opened a food delivery app or walked into a restaurant without thinking twice. Now I wandered the streets hoping someone might offer leftovers or that I might find a public food pantry. The city suddenly felt enormous. Every block demanded energy. Every decision mattered. I discovered a church that served free soup in the afternoon. The line outside was longer than I expected. Men and women of every age waited quietly, avoiding eye contact with strangers. Some wore dirty jackets while others looked almost identical to office workers except for their exhausted faces. Nobody complained. Nobody argued. Hunger had made patience a necessity. When my turn finally came, a volunteer handed me a bowl of vegetable soup, 2 slices of bread, and an apple. It was one of the simplest meals I had ever eaten, yet every bite felt valuable. I noticed that everyone finished every crumb. Nothing was wasted. After eating, I walked through several parks searching for a place where I might sleep later that night. Benches that once seemed perfectly comfortable now looked painfully narrow. Every shaded corner already belonged to someone. A man pushing a shopping cart nodded at me and quietly warned me not to sleep near the fountain because police officers frequently woke people there before sunrise. His advice surprised me because he expected nothing in return. That brief conversation challenged another assumption I had carried. I had imagined competition among homeless people would outweigh kindness. Instead, the first genuine act of generosity I experienced came from someone who possessed almost nothing. As evening approached, the temperature dropped quickly. Families packed up picnic blankets and returned to warm homes. Couples laughed while walking their dogs. Lights appeared in apartment windows across the street. I watched people living the life I had abandoned only that morning. The distance between us was less than 50 feet, yet it felt like another universe. I found a quiet bench beneath several trees and wrapped my thin blanket around my shoulders. Every passing sound became louder than usual. Car doors slamming made me jump. Footsteps behind me forced me to turn around repeatedly. I realized that a home provides something even more valuable than shelter. It provides permission to relax. Without walls or a locked door, my brain refused to stop scanning for danger. I barely slept. Every 30 minutes I opened my eyes to confirm that my backpack was still beside me. The cold slowly crept through the blanket and settled into my bones. By sunrise I had slept perhaps 2 broken hours. My back ached, my neck was stiff, and my confidence had already begun to disappear. Only 1 day had passed, yet the experiment no longer felt like an adventure. It felt frighteningly real. As I watched the first commuters rush toward another ordinary Tuesday, I understood something I had never appreciated before. Homelessness was not simply the absence of a house. It was the constant presence of uncertainty. And I still had 9 days left. I woke before the sun had fully risen, not because I was well rested but because the cold had become unbearable. Dew had settled over the blanket during the night, leaving it damp and heavier than before. My clothes smelled of wet grass and dust, and my entire body felt stiff from sleeping on a wooden bench. As I stretched, I noticed several office workers passing nearby. None of them acknowledged my existence. A few glanced in my direction for less than a second before quickly looking away, almost as if making eye contact would obligate them to stop. Until that morning, I had never realized how effortless it was to become invisible. Just 24 hours earlier I had been another man in business casual clothes carrying a laptop. Now, because my shirt was wrinkled, my hair was messy, and I had spent 1 night outside, people instinctively categorized me as someone outside their world. I walked toward a public restroom in a nearby park, hoping to wash my face. The sink worked, but the water was freezing. I stared at my reflection in the scratched mirror. My eyes already looked tired. Dark circles had begun forming beneath them, and the confident expression I had carried into this experiment had disappeared. I splashed water across my face several times and tried to straighten my clothes, but it made almost no difference. Looking presentable requires resources that I had always taken for granted. Clean laundry. A shower, deodorant, a razor, and a quiet bathroom suddenly seemed like luxuries rather than ordinary conveniences. Hunger returned quickly. I had eaten very little the previous day, and my stomach reminded me of that fact every few minutes. I wandered through downtown searching for another place serving free breakfast. The city smelled incredible. Fresh bread drifted from bakeries. Coffee aromas escaped from cafes every time customers opened the doors. I caught myself slowing down near restaurant windows simply to enjoy the smell before forcing myself to continue walking. Around 9 o'clock I found a community center offering oatmeal, bananas, and coffee. Volunteers welcomed everyone with the same polite smiles. While eating, I sat beside an older man named Raymond. His beard was almost completely gray, and his backpack looked as though it had survived many years of rough travel. We began talking, and I expected to hear a dramatic story filled with addiction or crime. Instead, he calmly explained that he had worked as a truck mechanic for over 30 years. After suffering a serious back injury, he lost his job. Medical bills consumed his savings. Rent increased several times while disability payments remained almost unchanged. Eventually he was evicted. Everything he described sounded painfully ordinary. There was no shocking twist, no spectacular mistake, just one setback after another until recovery became impossible. Before meeting Raymond, I had subconsciously believed homelessness required a catastrophic personal failure. Listening to him, I realized that sometimes bad luck, illness, and expensive housing were enough. We spent nearly an hour talking. He gave me practical advice about staying safe, avoiding isolated areas after dark, and protecting my backpack at all times. He laughed when I admitted this was my first experience sleeping outside. "The streets teach quickly," he said. "The first lesson is that exhaustion never really ends." His words stayed with me for the rest of the day. By afternoon my feet had begun hurting. I had walked for miles without realizing it because homeless life rarely allows someone to remain in one place. Security guards ask people to move. Parks close. Libraries have limited hours. Businesses discourage anyone who appears to linger too long. I found myself constantly relocating, carrying everything I owned on my shoulders. The backpack seemed light when I left home, but after 8 hours of walking it felt like a sack of bricks. Every bench became a temporary destination rather than a place to relax. I visited the public library to escape the afternoon heat. Inside, dozens of people quietly read books or use computers. I noticed several other visitors who appeared homeless. They sat silently, charging phones, reading newspapers, or simply enjoying air conditioning. Nobody disturbed anyone. The library offered something that money could not easily replace: dignity. It was one of the few places where nobody expected a purchase before allowing someone to exist indoors. I spent 2 hours reading, partly because I enjoyed the calm atmosphere and partly because I dreaded returning outside. When evening arrived, dark clouds covered the sky. Rain began falling just after sunset. My blanket offered almost no protection. I squeezed beneath the small roof of a bus stop alongside 3 other homeless people. None of us spoke much. Rainwater splashed across the pavement while cold wind blew through the open sides of the shelter. Hours passed painfully slowly. I watched buses arrive carrying passengers toward warm homes. They looked tired from work, yet every one of them possessed something I desperately missed: a destination. Around midnight the rain became heavier. Water reached my shoes, soaking my socks. My feet felt numb, and I began shivering uncontrollably. That was the moment when the experiment truly changed inside my mind. I stopped thinking about learning lessons or gathering experiences. My thoughts became far more primitive. I wanted dry clothes. I wanted warmth. I wanted a bed. I wanted a locked door. Comfort was no longer an abstract privilege. It had become the only thing I could think about. As I leaned against the cold wall of the bus shelter waiting for morning, I understood why so many people living on the streets appeared exhausted even when they had done nothing physically demanding. Survival itself was a full-time job, and I was only beginning to understand its cost. By the beginning of the 3rd day, time had started to lose its structure. When I lived in my apartment, every hour had a purpose. I woke up to an alarm, checked my calendar, answered emails, attended meetings, exercised, cooked dinner, and watched television before going to bed. Life followed an invisible schedule that I rarely questioned. Now the only schedule that mattered was the one created by survival. Breakfast depended on when a shelter opened its doors. Rest depended on whether security guards allowed me to remain in one place. Sleep depended on finding a relatively safe location before darkness covered the streets. Everything else became secondary. My body already felt different. My shoulders constantly ached from carrying my backpack. My feet burned after every long walk, and the lack of proper sleep made my thoughts slower than usual. I caught myself forgetting simple things. Twice that morning I reached into my pocket for a phone that was no longer there. The absence of technology created a strange silence. There were no notifications, no news headlines, no social media, and no music playing through headphones. Instead, I noticed sounds I had ignored for years. Birds landing on rooftops. Delivery trucks unloading boxes before sunrise. The rhythmic hiss of buses stopping every few blocks. Conversations drifting through open cafe doors. The city had always been noisy. But without distractions I finally heard it. Around mid-morning I walked toward a busy shopping district where hundreds of people hurried from one store to another. I stood near a corner watching the endless stream of strangers. Nobody stayed still for more than a few seconds. Everyone seemed to be chasing the next appointment, the next purchase, or the next responsibility. I wondered how many of them had noticed the homeless people sitting only a few feet away. Probably very few. It was not because they were cruel. It was because modern life trains people to focus only on their own destination. I had behaved exactly the same way countless times. A young woman carrying 2 cups of coffee accidentally bumped into my shoulder. She quickly apologized before looking directly at my face. For a brief second I expected her to continue walking like everyone else. Instead, she hesitated. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. The question caught me completely off guard. I nodded, unsure how to respond without revealing my experiment. She reached into her bag, handed me a wrapped sandwich, smiled politely, and disappeared into the crowd before I could properly thank her. I stared at the sandwich for several seconds before opening it. It was nothing extraordinary, just turkey, cheese, and lettuce on whole grain bread, yet it felt like a gift far greater than its price. The food filled my stomach, but the kindness filled something much deeper. During the previous 2 days, most people had avoided even looking at me. That single act reminded me how powerful simple compassion could be. Later that afternoon I met a woman named Linda sitting outside the public library. She was reading a worn paperback novel while eating crackers from a plastic bag. She noticed me looking at the book and asked whether I liked mysteries. We spent nearly an hour discussing detective novels, classic authors, and our favorite fictional detectives. Her knowledge amazed me. Before becoming homeless, she had worked as a high school English teacher. She lost her apartment after caring for her husband through a long illness that emptied their savings. After he passed away, depression consumed her. Bills accumulated. She eventually lost everything except 2 suitcases full of books, most of which had since been sold or stolen. As she spoke, she never asked me for money or sympathy. She simply enjoyed discussing literature. It struck me how quickly society reduces people to labels. Homeless. Addict. Beggar. Yet behind every label was an individual history containing careers, relationships, talents, dreams, heartbreak, and memories. Homelessness had not erased who Linda was. It had only changed where she slept. As evening approached, I decided to visit a shelter for the first time. I arrived nearly an hour before the doors opened. Yet a long line had already formed. Some people chatted quietly while others stood in complete silence. Everyone understood that beds were limited. The atmosphere carried a mixture of hope and anxiety. I spoke with a volunteer who explained that demand had increased dramatically during the past year. Some nights they simply ran out of space. Fortunately, I was admitted before the shelter reached capacity. Inside, rows of metal bunk beds filled a large room. Volunteers served a simple dinner consisting of rice, beans, vegetables, and bread. After eating, everyone followed unspoken routines. Some washed clothes in small sinks. Others read books, played cards, or simply lay on their bed staring at the ceiling. The room was safe, warm, and clean compared to sleeping outside, yet privacy did not exist. Coughing echoed through the room. Someone snored loudly before lights were even turned off. Personal conversations blended into one constant murmur. Every movement reminded me that dozens of strangers shared the same limited space. When the lights finally went out, I expected to sleep immediately. Instead, I lay awake listening to the sounds surrounding me. A man quietly cried somewhere across the room. Another whispered prayers beneath his blanket. Someone else coughed continuously for nearly an hour. Those sounds affected me more than I expected because they revealed a hidden reality. Homelessness was not only physical hardship. It carried emotional exhaustion that rarely appeared in statistics or newspaper articles. Each sound represented another person fighting battles invisible to everyone else. Before closing my eyes, I realized that I had entered this experiment believing I would spend 10 days observing homelessness. Instead, homelessness was slowly changing the way I observed humanity itself. The fourth morning began with the sound of volunteers gently waking everyone before sunrise. The shelter needed to be cleaned, which meant every guest had to leave shortly after breakfast. I folded my blanket, adjusted the straps of my backpack, and stepped back onto the street. The warmth of the shelter disappeared behind me the moment the door closed. Once again, I had nowhere to go. That simple reality was becoming the hardest part of the experience. Most people think of a home as a place where they sleep, but I was beginning to understand that a home is also the place where you wait. You wait for the rain to stop. You wait until your next appointment. You wait when you are tired, sick, or simply bored. Without a home, waiting becomes a public activity, and public spaces rarely welcome people who have nowhere else to be. I wandered through downtown with no destination other than staying warm. Every bench eventually became uncomfortable. Every park eventually became too exposed. Every shopping center had security guards watching for people who appeared to be lingering without buying anything. By late morning I had already been asked twice if I was planning to move along. Neither request was rude, but both carried the same message. You are allowed to pass through this place, but you are not allowed to belong here. That distinction stayed with me. I had spent years believing cities belonged equally to everyone. They did not. They belonged most comfortably to people who could afford to participate in them. Everyone else was tolerated only temporarily. Around noon I found myself sitting near a construction site where workers were eating lunch. One of them, a large man wearing a dusty yellow helmet, noticed me watching them from a distance. After a few minutes he walked over carrying an extra sandwich and a bottle of water. My wife always packs too much food, he said with a smile. Help me avoid wasting it. His kindness was offered so naturally that it protected my dignity. He did not treat me like a charity project. He treated me like another human being who happened to be hungry. We talked for 15 minutes. He told me about his children, complained about the summer heat, and laughed about how his wife never believed him when he insisted she packed too much lunch. Before returning to work, he simply wished me a better day. I watched him walk away, realizing that compassion often arrived without speeches or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it looked like half of a sandwich and a few minutes of ordinary conversation. That afternoon I decided to spend time observing rather than constantly moving. I sat outside a busy train station where thousands of people passed every hour. The patterns became obvious surprisingly quickly. Children noticed homeless people almost immediately. Many stared openly until their parents quietly redirected their attention. Teenagers often glanced briefly before continuing to laugh with friends. Adults behaved differently. Most avoided looking entirely. Some pretended to be deeply interested in their phones while walking past. Others adjusted their path slightly to create more distance. Only a handful actually made eye contact. I recognized those behaviors because I had done the same thing myself countless times. Looking away protected me from discomfort. If I never truly saw someone, I never had to ask myself whether I should help. Late in the afternoon an unexpected incident shattered my sense of emotional distance. A man who appeared to be struggling with severe mental illness began shouting at invisible people near the station entrance. His clothes were torn, his face was dirty, and he looked terrified by something nobody else could see. Pedestrians quickly crossed the street to avoid him. Some laughed nervously. Others filmed him with their phones. Very few seemed concerned about the obvious suffering behind his behavior. Eventually 2 outreach workers approached him with remarkable patience. They spoke softly, learned his name, offered him water, and slowly convinced him to walk with them toward a support vehicle waiting nearby. Watching them reminded me that homelessness often overlaps with mental illness. Trauma, addiction, or disability in ways that outsiders rarely understand. It was easy to judge someone based on 30 seconds of unusual behavior. It was much harder to imagine the years of pain that might have led to that moment. As the evening grew colder, I searched for another safe place to spend the night. The shelter I had used the previous evening was already full when I arrived. I stood in line anyway, hoping someone might leave, but every bed remained occupied. The volunteer apologized sincerely before suggesting another shelter nearly 3 miles away. I started walking. Halfway there I learned that it too had reached capacity. For the first time since beginning the experiment. Panic quietly settled into my chest. Darkness was falling, temperatures were dropping, and I had no plan. I eventually returned to the same park where I had spent my first night. The familiar bench felt even harder than I remembered. I wrapped myself tightly in the blanket and placed my backpack beneath my head. Sleep refused to come. Every passing stranger made me alert. Every distant siren seemed closer than it actually was. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, a group of intoxicated young men walked through the park laughing loudly. One of them noticed me lying on the bench and shouted something insulting before the others pulled him away. They disappeared within seconds. But my heartbeat remained fast long after they were gone. I realized that fear was becoming part of my nightly routine. The lack of physical violence did not mean the absence of stress. Simply wondering whether something bad might happen was exhausting enough. As dawn slowly colored the sky, I counted the days remaining. 6 more. At the beginning of this journey, 10 days had sounded surprisingly short. Now each sunrise felt like another mountain waiting to be climbed. I was beginning to understand why escaping homelessness could be so difficult. When every day demanded nearly all of your physical and emotional energy, planning for a better future became an unimaginable luxury. Surviving today consumed everything. Tomorrow would simply have to wait. When I opened my eyes on the 5th morning, I could not immediately remember where I was. For a brief, beautiful second, my mind assumed I was waking up in my own bed. Then the stiffness in my back, the rough wooden bench beneath me, and the cold air against my face reminded me of reality. I sat up slowly and noticed how filthy my clothes had become. Dirt covered my jeans. My jacket carried the smell of rain, sweat, and the city itself. My beard had grown unevenly, and my hair stuck out in every direction. I caught my reflection in the dark window of a closed store and barely recognized the man staring back at me. It shocked me how quickly appearance changed when ordinary routines disappeared. 5 days without regular access to a shower, clean clothing, or a mirror had transformed me into someone strangers instinctively avoided. That realization forced me to question how much of my own confidence had always depended on looking respectable. Confidence, I discovered, was surprisingly fragile. I spent the early morning searching for a place to wash. A public restroom inside a transportation terminal offered running water, paper towels, and a cracked mirror. I cleaned my face as thoroughly as possible, washed my hands repeatedly, and tried to remove some of the dirt from my jacket using wet paper towels. The results were almost laughable. A few stains disappeared, but exhaustion still showed clearly in my face. My eyes looked older than they had only 5 days earlier. It occurred to me that many employers tell homeless people to just get a job, yet even reaching a job interview while carrying everything you own and wearing dirty clothes would be incredibly difficult. Looking presentable requires stability, and stability is exactly what homelessness destroys. Later that morning I visited a non-profit organization that offered free showers, donated clothing, and basic hygiene supplies. The line stretched around the building. While waiting, I spoke with a young man named Marcus who appeared to be no older than 23. He had recently aged out of the foster care system. Without family support, he struggled to keep up with rising rent while working part-time at a grocery store. When his landlord increased the rent beyond what he could afford, he had nowhere else to go. He still had a job. He still worked nearly every day. Yet he slept in shelters whenever space was available. His story completely challenged another assumption I had carried. I had unconsciously believed that employment and homelessness were opposites. Marcus proved otherwise. Having a job did not automatically guarantee having a home. Inside the center, volunteers distributed soap, shampoo, toothbrushes, clean socks, and donated clothing. I finally took my first proper shower since leaving my apartment. The hot water lasted only a few minutes, but those minutes felt almost luxurious. As dirt disappeared down the drain, I experienced something unexpected. I did not simply feel cleaner. I felt more human. The shower restored a sense of dignity that I had not realized I was losing. After changing into donated clothes that fit reasonably well, I looked at myself in another mirror. I still appeared tired, but no longer invisible. It amazed me that something as ordinary as a clean shirt could change the way both I and others perceived me. Throughout the afternoon, people smiled at me more often. A cashier wished me a pleasant day. A stranger held a door open for me. Nothing else about me had changed except my appearance. The experience was both encouraging and deeply unsettling. It revealed how quickly society forms judgments based on clothing, grooming, and visible signs of poverty. During the afternoon I volunteered to help distribute bottled water and fruit outside the same nonprofit center. I wanted to contribute instead of only receiving assistance. As people lined up, I recognized several faces from previous days. Raymond greeted me with a broad smile. Linda proudly showed me another mystery novel she had borrowed from the library. Marcus rushed off to begin his afternoon work shift wearing the cleanest clothes he owned. Watching everyone interact, I noticed something that television reports rarely captured. There was humor. People joked with volunteers, celebrated small victories, and encouraged one another through difficult days. One man proudly announced that he had finally replaced his lost identification card after weeks of paperwork, and several others applauded as though he had won an award. At first that reaction seemed excessive. Then I realized how important small successes become when life is built around constant setbacks. Something as simple as obtaining identification could be the first step toward employment, housing, and stability. Every victory mattered because every obstacle was enormous. As evening approached, I sat alone outside the center reflecting on everything I had experienced so far. Before beginning this journey, I had imagined homelessness primarily as a material problem. I thought about missing beds, empty refrigerators, and cold nights. Those hardships were certainly real, but they were only part of the story. The deeper struggle was psychological. Every day required defending your dignity against countless small humiliations. Being ignored. Being distrusted. Being told to leave. Being judged before speaking. Gradually those experiences threatened to reshape the way a person viewed themselves. I began to understand why hope could slowly disappear even without a single catastrophic event. It was not one enormous defeat that broke people. It was thousands of tiny defeats accumulating day after day. That night I was fortunate enough to secure another bed at the shelter. As I lay on the thin mattress, I realized I had reached the halfway point of my experiment. 5 days remained. Yet something unexpected had already happened. I no longer counted the homeless people I met as strangers. I knew their names. I knew pieces of their histories. I knew what made them laugh and what kept them awake at night. They were no longer statistics living on the edge of society. They had become individuals whose lives had intersected with mine, and I knew that once this experiment ended, I would never again be able to walk past someone sleeping on a sidewalk without wondering what story had brought them there. The sixth day began with something I had not expected to miss so deeply: silence. Not the silence of an empty street at dawn, but the silence of having a private space where no one else could enter without permission. Even inside the shelter, surrounded by kind volunteers and people doing their best to survive, there was never a moment of true privacy. Someone was always talking, coughing, walking, or searching through a backpack. I suddenly understood why people close bathroom doors even when they live alone. Privacy is not simply about hiding from others. It is about having one place where your mind can finally stop being alert. During the previous 5 days, I had lived without that feeling. My brain never completely relaxed. Every sound demanded attention. Every unfamiliar face required evaluation. Every decision carried consequences that had once seemed insignificant. Where should I leave my backpack while using the restroom? Which street felt safer after dark? Should I trust the stranger offering advice? Constant decision-making gradually became exhausting. I had never realized how much mental energy was required simply to remain safe. After breakfast, I walked with Raymond toward a neighborhood where several churches and charities operated throughout the week. He explained that surviving on the streets often depended on knowing an invisible schedule. One church offered breakfast every Tuesday. Another distributed clothing on Thursdays. A nonprofit provided free medical checkups every second Friday of the month. These organizations formed an unofficial safety net that many homeless people memorized as carefully as office workers memorized meeting schedules. Missing one opportunity could mean waiting several days for another. As we walked, Raymond laughed and said, "People think we don't have calendars. We probably know the city's schedule better than anyone." His comment stayed with me. Homelessness was not a life without structure. It was a life built around entirely different priorities. Around noon, we entered a public park where several volunteers were handing out sandwiches and bottled water. While everyone waited patiently, a middle-aged man wearing an expensive business suit approached one of the volunteers. He spoke quietly before leaving a large envelope behind. Curious, I asked what had happened. The volunteer smiled and explained that the man visited once every month to donate grocery store gift cards without ever giving his name. He never asked for recognition, photographs, or social media posts. He simply arrived, donated, and disappeared. Watching that interaction reminded me that generosity often happened quietly. The world contained far more kindness than the nightly news suggested. Unfortunately, kindness rarely became a headline. That afternoon, the weather turned unexpectedly hot. The pavement reflected heat upward until every step felt heavier than the last. I searched for shade beneath large trees, but even resting became uncomfortable. Without air conditioning or a cool place to recover, my energy disappeared rapidly. Dehydration became a constant concern. Water fountains suddenly became valuable landmarks instead of background objects I had ignored for years. I began planning walking routes based on where I could refill my bottle rather than where I actually wanted to go. Once again, Ordinary parts of the city revealed entirely different meanings when viewed through the eyes of someone with almost nothing. Later in the day, I sat outside the library with Linda. She was writing in a small notebook balanced carefully on her knee. When I asked what she was working on, she smiled shyly before showing me several pages of poetry. The poems described memories of family dinners, classrooms filled with curious students, rainy afternoons spent reading novels, and the quiet loneliness of sleeping outdoors. Her writing was beautiful. Some verses were hopeful while others carried overwhelming sadness, but every line felt honest. I complimented her talent, and she shrugged modestly. "I used to think losing my house was the worst thing that happened to me," she said softly. "Then I realized losing the feeling that people saw me was even worse." Her sentence struck me harder than anything I had heard during the experiment. People saw her. They looked directly at her almost every day. But they did not truly see her. There was a difference. They saw dirty clothes, an old backpack, and someone sitting alone on a bench. They did not see the teacher who had inspired hundreds of students. They did not see the woman who still loved literature enough to borrow books every week. They did not see the poet quietly filling notebook pages while the rest of the city rushed past. For the first time, I wondered how many extraordinary people I had unknowingly ignored throughout my own life simply because circumstances had hidden them behind appearances. That evening, something happened that filled me with unexpected guilt. As I waited outside another shelter, one of the volunteers recognized me from previous visits. She smiled warmly and greeted me by name because I had introduced myself earlier in the week. When the shelter reached capacity, she quietly reserved one of the final beds for me. I accepted it automatically before realizing what that meant. Someone else, someone who had probably been living on the streets for months or even years, would now spend another night outside because I occupied that space as part of an experiment. The thought haunted me throughout dinner. I considered giving the bed away, but another volunteer explained that the remaining people had already been redirected to a different emergency shelter with available space. Even so, I could not stop thinking about the privilege I still carried. I knew this experience had an ending. In only a few days I would return to my apartment, take a long shower, sleep in my own bed, and resume my ordinary life. Nearly everyone around me lacked that certainty. They did not know where they would be next month, or even next week. As I lay in the shelter that night, staring at the ceiling above my bunk, I realized the greatest difference between me and the people surrounding me was not money. It was the existence of an exit. For me, homelessness was temporary by choice. For many of them, it had become a reality without a visible ending. That understanding filled me with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow unlike anything I had ever experienced before. The seventh morning arrived faster than I expected, and for the first time since beginning this journey, I noticed that I was no longer thinking about the date. My old life had revolved around calendars, appointments, deadlines, and reminders, but those concepts had gradually disappeared from my mind. Survival had replaced productivity as my primary objective. Instead of asking myself what I wanted to accomplish today, I asked where I could find my next meal, where I could refill my water bottle, and where I might safely spend the coming night. My priorities had become astonishingly simple, yet each one demanded far more effort than I had ever imagined. After leaving the shelter, I walked through streets that had become strangely familiar over the previous week. I knew which coffee shops threw away unsold pastries at the end of the day, which public buildings allowed people to use their restrooms without asking questions, and which security guards treated homeless people with respect instead of suspicion. The city no longer looked like the place I had known for years. It had transformed into a map of opportunities and obstacles. Every corner carried a memory. Every building represented either safety or rejection. Around mid-morning I found myself sitting near a small public square watching office employees eat lunch beneath the warm sunlight. Their conversations floated through the air as they discussed vacations, weekend plans, promotions, and rising housing prices. One man complained that his apartment felt too small after purchasing a larger television. Another joked that he desperately needed a vacation because work had become stressful. I caught myself smiling rather than judging them. Only a week earlier, I would probably have joined exactly the same conversation. It was not that their problems were imaginary. They were simply different. Perspective had quietly shifted beneath my feet. I had learned that comfort often hides the existence of greater struggles without making people intentionally selfish. Shortly before noon, I met a man named Carlos while waiting in line at a community meal program. Unlike many others I had met, Carlos still carried himself with remarkable confidence. His clothes were worn but clean, and he spoke with calm determination. During lunch he explained that he had been homeless for nearly 18 months after losing both his apartment and his small business during an economic downturn. Instead of giving up, he spent every morning searching for temporary construction jobs, every afternoon filling out housing applications, and every evening attending free financial literacy classes offered by a nonprofit organization. "The hardest battle isn't finding food," he told me. "It's waking up every day believing tomorrow can still be different." Those words stayed with me long after our conversation ended. Hope, I realized, required tremendous effort when daily life constantly presented reasons to surrender. As the afternoon progressed, clouds gathered overhead, and heavy winds began sweeping through the streets. Within minutes, rain started falling with surprising intensity. People carrying umbrellas hurried toward parking garages and office buildings while those of us without shelter searched desperately for somewhere dry. I joined several others beneath the narrow entrance of a closed storefront. Rainwater splashed across the sidewalk while cold gusts pushed moisture beneath the small overhang. Nobody complained. Everyone simply waited. An elderly woman standing beside me quietly removed a plastic poncho from her backpack and handed it to a younger woman carrying a small child. She kept nothing for herself. Watching that simple exchange affected me deeply. Generosity among people with almost nothing often appeared greater than generosity among those who possessed abundance. Perhaps scarcity taught people to recognize one another's needs more clearly. When the rain finally stopped, the air turned noticeably colder. I walked toward the river hoping to clear my thoughts. Sitting alone on a bench, I opened my notebook and began writing everything I had experienced during the previous 7 days. At first I intended to record facts. Instead, I found myself writing about emotions. I wrote about how frightening darkness felt without a locked door. I wrote about the humiliation of being ignored. I wrote about the relief of receiving a hot meal and the unexpected joy of ordinary conversations with strangers. Most importantly, I wrote about how quickly my assumptions had collapsed. Before this experiment, I believed homelessness existed mainly because of personal choices. Now I understood that every individual story contained different causes, different obstacles, and different possibilities. Some people battled addiction. Others escaped domestic violence. Some suffered illnesses. Others simply lost jobs during difficult economic times. There was no single explanation because there was no single homeless person. There were only human beings whose lives had unfolded differently than mine. As sunset approached, I returned to the shelter where I had spent the previous evening. The volunteer at the front desk smiled when she recognized me. During dinner, laughter echoed across several tables as people shared stories about unusual jobs they had once held. One man had repaired airplanes. Another had worked as a chef aboard cruise ships. Linda described hilarious moments from her years as an English teacher, causing everyone nearby to laugh. Listening to those conversations, I realized how completely society misunderstands homelessness. The stereotype suggests lives without history, yet every person in that dining room possessed decades of memories, achievements, failures, friendships, talents, and dreams. Homelessness had not erased their identities. It had merely interrupted their stories. That night, lying on the familiar bunk bed, I noticed something unsettling. Part of me had begun adapting to this life. I no longer felt shocked by sleeping in a room filled with strangers. I no longer questioned where my next meal might come from because I had learned the routines. The uncertainty remained, but my mind had adjusted to it. That realization frightened me more than anything else. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability to adapt, even to hardship. While that resilience allows people to survive unimaginable circumstances, it also means that suffering can slowly become normal. As I closed my eyes, I wondered how many people had originally believed their homelessness would last only a few days before gradually realizing weeks had become months and months had become years. The thought lingered in my mind long after the shelter lights disappeared into darkness, and for the first time since this journey began, I was no longer counting the days until I returned home. I was thinking instead about the people who had no idea when, or if, they ever would. The 8th morning began with an unusual feeling of confidence. Not because life had become easier, but because I had finally learned how to survive it. I knew where to find breakfast without wandering for hours. I knew which streets felt safest during the day and which neighborhoods became dangerous after sunset. I knew how to conserve my energy instead of walking endlessly without purpose. That realization brought me an unexpected sense of sadness. Only 8 days earlier I had been completely unfamiliar with this invisible world, and now I was beginning to navigate it almost instinctively. I wondered how many skills homeless people developed that the rest of society never noticed. They became experts at reading people, predicting weather, remembering charity schedules, identifying safe places, and protecting the few possessions they owned. These were survival skills that most housed people would hopefully never need, yet mastering them required remarkable intelligence and adaptability. After eating breakfast at a community kitchen, I spent the morning walking through neighborhoods I had rarely visited before. Without realizing it, I had started observing buildings differently. Expensive apartment complexes no longer impressed me because of their architecture. Instead, I noticed the warm lights behind the windows, the balconies filled with plants, and the curtains that offered privacy. A home was no longer simply a financial achievement. It represented security, stability, and the ability to close the world outside whenever life became overwhelming. Those simple privileges suddenly seemed priceless. Around midday I met a young woman named Emily sitting outside a small health clinic. She looked exhausted, but unlike many people I had met, she carried a folder filled with neatly organized documents. As we talked, she explained that she spent nearly every day attending appointments with housing agencies, employment counselors, and social workers. She had escaped an abusive relationship several months earlier and had been living between shelters ever since. Her determination impressed me immediately. Every paper inside her folder represented another attempt to rebuild her life. "People think we're doing nothing," she said quietly. "They don't see that surviving homelessness is already a full-time job." I looked through the pages she showed me. Housing applications. Identification forms. Employment records. Medical paperwork. Appointment confirmations. Every document required another office, another waiting room, another interview, another bus ride. Escaping homelessness involved navigating an exhausting maze of bureaucracy while already carrying the emotional weight of losing almost everything. I had never considered how difficult it must be to organize paperwork when you had no permanent address, no reliable transportation, and no secure place to store important documents. During the afternoon I visited a public park where several volunteers organized recreational activities for children living in temporary shelters with their families. Watching them play was both joyful and heartbreaking. They laughed while chasing one another across the grass, completely absorbed in games that looked no different from those played by children anywhere else. Yet many of them would return that evening to crowded shelters instead of bedrooms decorated with their favorite toys. One little boy proudly showed me a small toy dinosaur that he carried everywhere. "This is my house," he said, placing the dinosaur inside his backpack before smiling. His innocent comment stayed with me long after he ran back to join the other children. For adults, homelessness often meant financial instability. For children, it meant growing up without the certainty that every child deserved. Later that day I helped volunteers distribute donated blankets and winter clothing. I noticed something that surprised me. Many people politely declined items they did not immediately need, asking volunteers to save them for someone else. One man accepted gloves but refused a second pair because he already owned one. Another woman insisted that a heavier blanket should go to an elderly man sleeping outside every night. These moments quietly challenged another stereotype I had once believed. Scarcity had not destroyed generosity. In many cases, it had strengthened it. People who understood hardship often recognized another person's needs before considering their own. As evening approached, I walked alone through the city center. Rush hour had transformed sidewalks into rivers of hurried faces. Thousands of people moved around me, each carrying invisible concerns about work, family, relationships, or finances. A week earlier I would have blended naturally into that crowd. Now I stood outside it, observing rather than participating. It occurred to me that homelessness was not only physical exclusion. It was social exclusion. Conversation stopped when you approached. Invitations disappeared. Opportunities became fewer. The world continued moving at the same speed, but you somehow found yourself left behind. That feeling of separation was perhaps the deepest wound of all. Before returning to the shelter, I bought a cup of coffee using a gift card that one of the volunteers had received through donations and shared with several guests. I sat outside holding the warm paper cup between my hands. The coffee itself was ordinary, but the warmth spread slowly through my fingers and into my body. It reminded me how powerful small comforts could become after days without them. A warm drink. Dry socks. A clean blanket. A friendly conversation. These were things I had once overlooked because they had always been available. Now each one felt like a gift. That night, lying awake before falling asleep, I thought about my apartment. I imagined my bookshelf, my kitchen, the familiar sound of my refrigerator, and the comfortable mattress waiting only 2 days away. Yet something had changed inside me. I no longer missed those things simply because they were comfortable. I missed them because they represented something deeper than convenience. They represented belonging. A home is the one place in the world where you are never expected to justify your presence. You do not need to buy anything, explain yourself, or leave after a certain number of hours. You simply exist, and that existence is enough. After 8 days of living without that certainty, I finally understood that the greatest luxury I had ever possessed was not my apartment itself. It was the quiet peace of knowing that, no matter how difficult the day became, I always had somewhere to return. When I woke on the 9th morning, the realization struck me almost immediately. Only 2 days remained before I would return to my normal life. Instead of feeling excited, I experienced something I had never anticipated. I felt guilty. Throughout the previous 8 days I had formed friendships with people whose lives would continue exactly as they were after my experiment ended. I would go home, take a hot shower, sleep in my own bed, and tell others what I had learned. Raymond would still wake up wondering where he would spend the next night. Linda would still carry her notebook from bench to bench, writing poems that few people would ever read. Marcus would continue working long shifts while searching desperately for affordable housing. Emily would attend another series of appointments, hoping that one application might finally change her future. My experience had an ending. Theirs did not. That difference became impossible to ignore. After breakfast, I decided to spend as much time as possible listening instead of observing. During the previous week I had asked countless questions, but now I simply wanted people to tell their stories without interruption. Raymond and I sat beneath a large oak tree in the park where we had first met. For nearly 2 hours he spoke about his childhood, his years working as a mechanic, his marriage, and the small house he and his wife had once dreamed of retiring in. He showed me a faded photograph that he kept inside his wallet. It showed a younger version of himself standing proudly beside a bright red pickup truck with his wife smiling beside him. Looking at the photograph, I found it almost impossible to connect the confident man in the picture with the tired person sitting next to me. Then I realized something important. They were exactly the same person. Circumstances had changed. His identity had not. I still wake up feeling like the same man, Raymond said quietly while looking at the photograph. The world just stopped seeing me that way. His words lingered in the silence between us. Later that afternoon, I walked with Linda to the public library. She returned one mystery novel and borrowed another. The librarian greeted her by name and asked whether she had enjoyed the previous book. Their conversation lasted less than a minute, yet I noticed the difference it made. Linda smiled more brightly afterward. She always remembers my name, Linda said as we left the building. Most days that's enough to remind me I still exist. That sentence broke something inside me. How many times had I forgotten names because I was busy? How many opportunities had I missed to make another person feel seen? Sometimes dignity arrived through extraordinary generosity. Sometimes it arrived through something as simple as remembering a name. During the afternoon I visited a busy intersection where several people held cardboard signs asking passing drivers for help. I stood nearby watching traffic. Some drivers stared straight ahead, pretending not to notice anyone outside their windows. Others politely shook their heads with apologetic expressions. A few lowered their windows to hand over bottles of water, snacks, or a few dollars before driving away. The reactions varied enormously, but what interested me most was the emotional tension visible on both sides. Many drivers appeared uncomfortable. Many homeless people looked embarrassed to ask for assistance. Neither side seemed to enjoy the interaction. Poverty, I realized, often created awkwardness rather than conversation. A little later, an elderly woman approached one of the men holding a cardboard sign. Instead of giving him money, she handed him a handwritten note folded neatly into a small square. After she left, curiosity overcame me, and I asked him what it said. He smiled. "It's just a Bible verse," he replied. "She writes one every week." "Does it help?" I asked. He folded the paper carefully and placed it inside his pocket. "It reminds me that someone spent 5 minutes thinking about me before they left home this morning." That answer surprised me. The value of the note had nothing to do with religion. Its value came from the fact that someone had cared enough to prepare it. As evening approached, I found myself reflecting on my own habits before beginning this journey. I remembered walking quickly past homeless people because I felt uncomfortable. I remembered convincing myself that someone else would probably help. I remembered assuming that every person sleeping outside had somehow chosen that life. Those memories filled me with regret, not because I believed I had been cruel, but because I had been indifferent. Indifference now seemed far more dangerous than open hostility. Hostility at least acknowledged another person's existence. Indifference quietly erased it. That evening the shelter organized a simple communal dinner. Volunteers had prepared pasta, salad, bread, and homemade cookies donated by a local bakery. The atmosphere felt unusually cheerful. People laughed, exchanged stories, and teased one another like old friends gathered around a family table. Watching everyone together, I realized that community did not disappear when people lost their homes. In many ways, it became even more important. Survival depended not only on food and shelter but also on friendship, shared information, encouragement, and simple human connection. After dinner, several people gathered outside the shelter to watch the sunset. The sky glowed with shades of orange, pink, and deep purple as the city lights slowly illuminated one building after another. Nobody spoke for several minutes. The silence felt peaceful rather than uncomfortable. Finally, Marcus broke it. "You know," he said while staring at the horizon, "people think the worst part of homelessness is sleeping outside." He paused before continuing. "It isn't." "What is?" I asked. He smiled sadly. feeling like the rest of the world has already moved on without you. No one answered. There was nothing to add. As darkness settled over the city, I returned inside the shelter and climbed into my bunk. Tomorrow would be my final day living this life. Part of me desperately wanted to return home. Another part wished I could somehow take everyone I had met with me. I knew that was impossible. But I also knew something else with complete certainty. The person who had locked his apartment door 9 days earlier believed homelessness was a social issue that affected strangers. The person lying awake in the shelter now understood that homelessness was about people with names, memories, talents, dreams, and stories. Once you truly knew those stories, it became impossible to look away again. The 10th morning arrived quietly, and for the first time since leaving my apartment, I woke before anyone else in the shelter. I lay still for several minutes, listening to the familiar sounds that had become part of my daily routine. Someone softly snored across the room. A volunteer arranged breakfast supplies in the kitchen. A zipper slowly opened as another guest searched through a backpack containing everything they owned. Only 10 days earlier these sounds had seemed foreign. Now they felt strangely familiar. I realized that human beings can adapt to almost any environment given enough time, and that thought frightened me. If I had begun adjusting after only 10 days, what would months or years have done to my expectations, my ambitions, and my understanding of what a normal life looked like? After breakfast, I thanked every volunteer individually before leaving the shelter for the final time. They smiled warmly, unaware that my experiment was coming to an end. I spent the morning walking through the city without any particular destination. The streets looked exactly as they had 10 days earlier, yet everything about the way I saw them had changed. I no longer noticed the newest office buildings or the expensive cars parked along the sidewalks. Instead, I noticed public drinking fountains, shaded benches, soup kitchens, libraries, shelters, and community centers. My eyes had learned to search for survival instead of comfort. I passed hundreds of people on their way to work, and I wondered how many of them realized that an entirely different city existed alongside the one they experienced every day. It was invisible until life forced you into it. Around noon I met Raymond one last time. We shared lunch at the same church where I had eaten my first free meal. He asked what I planned to do after leaving, and for a moment I considered telling him the entire truth. Instead, I simply said that I hoped my situation would improve soon. He smiled and shook my hand. "Don't stop believing it can," he said. "Hope disappears only when you decide to let it." Before we parted, he reached into his backpack and handed me the faded photograph of himself and his wife. I immediately tried to refuse, but he insisted. "Keep it," he said. "Sometimes people need proof that every homeless person had another life before this one." I carefully placed the photograph inside my notebook, knowing it would become one of the most valuable things I owned. Later that afternoon I found Linda sitting outside the library, writing another poem in her notebook. We spoke for nearly an hour about books, life, and the strange ways people measure success. Before leaving, she tore one page from her notebook and folded it into my hand. It contained a short poem she had written that morning. The final sentence read, "A home is built from walls, but belonging is built from kindness." I thanked her, unable to find words that felt large enough for the moment. Marcus stopped briefly on his way to work and proudly told me he had been offered additional hours at the grocery store. Emily excitedly explained that one of her housing applications had finally advanced to the next stage. None of these developments guaranteed permanent change, but they represented something equally important. They represented movement. Hope often returned in small steps rather than giant leaps. As evening approached, I walked back toward my apartment building for the first time in 10 days. My brother was waiting exactly where we had agreed to meet. When he saw me, he hugged me tightly before saying anything. He later admitted that he had barely recognized me from a distance. I looked thinner. My beard had grown unevenly. My clothes hung loosely from my shoulders. I accepted my apartment key from his hand and stood silently in front of the building. 10 days earlier I had walked out without fully appreciating what I was leaving behind. Now I understood that the small metal key resting in my palm represented far more than access to an apartment. It represented security, privacy, stability, rest. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The familiar scent of my home immediately surrounded me. Everything remained exactly where I had left it. My books still rested on the shelves. My favorite chair still faced the window. The refrigerator hummed quietly in the kitchen. Nothing had changed, yet I had changed completely. I stood in the middle of the living room for several minutes without moving. Tears filled my eyes unexpectedly. I had never cried simply because I was inside a home before. That evening I took the longest shower of my life. As warm water washed away 10 days of dirt and exhaustion, I thought about everyone I had met. Raymond was probably searching for a safe place to sleep. Linda might be writing another poem beneath the library lights before closing time. Marcus would likely finish his shift and hope for an available shelter bed. Emily would organize another stack of paperwork for tomorrow's appointments. My experiment had ended. Theirs had not. During the following weeks, I kept thinking about those 10 days. I could have written an article and moved on with my life, but that no longer felt enough. I began volunteering every weekend at the same shelters and community kitchens that had welcomed me. I donated money more thoughtfully than before, but I also donated something equally valuable, my time. I listened to stories instead of making assumptions. I learned names instead of seeing labels. I discovered that meaningful change begins with recognizing another person's humanity before trying to solve their problems. People often ask me what the hardest part of living like a homeless person for 10 days was. They expect me to mention hunger, cold weather, uncomfortable benches, or sleepless nights. Those things were undeniably difficult, but they were not the hardest part. The hardest part was realizing how easily society stops seeing people once they lose a home. Homelessness is not merely the absence of a roof. It is the daily struggle to remain visible in a world that has become remarkably skilled at looking away. Those 10 days taught me more about gratitude than the previous 35 years of my life. They taught me that dignity cannot be measured by income, that kindness often comes from those who possess the least. And that every person sleeping on a sidewalk carries a story far more complex than anyone passing by could ever imagine. Most importantly, they taught me that compassion is not feeling sorry for someone from a comfortable distance. Compassion begins the moment you choose to truly see another human being. That lesson did not end when I unlocked my apartment door. It became a permanent part of the person who walked through it.